Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. I'm going to give a few minutes to allow for some additional participants to log in, so we will begin at 12:05. I have muted everyone upon entry, but if you could make sure that you stay muted throughout the program, that will be appreciated, as this presentation is being recorded for GPS. This presentation has been approved for CEUs, so please make sure your complete name and credentials are shown as your display name and not in the chat or emailed to me. The CEU approver must see your complete name on the attendance list to receive the CEU. If you're unsure on how to change your display name, just click on the three dots where your display name is showing now and select rename. If you've called in for the presentation, there's no way to track if you attended, so please log in using the Zoom link provided. Thanks for your patience, and we will begin the presentation shortly. Hello again, everyone, and welcome to our brown bag today. Just a quick reminder before we begin that I've muted everyone upon entry, but if you could make sure that you stay muted throughout the program, that will be appreciated as this presentation is being recorded for GPS. Feel free to utilize the chat feature for any questions you have for the presenter today. And please direct them to myself so that I can read them to the presenter anonymously throughout the presentation. Also, a reminder that this presentation has been approved for CEUs. And in order to receive those CEUs, you must complete and turn in the evaluation that was attached to the advertisement for this presentation to myself within 24 hours and have your full first and last name as well as your credentials shown on the display name for this Zoom. If you're not familiar with how to change your display name, you can click on the 3 dots next to your current display name and select rename. We cannot provide CEUs for names or email addresses listed in the chat or phone numbers that are displayed. So please be sure you update your display name and log in using the Zoom link provided. Today's presentation is titled Grief in the Workplace, and giving our presentation today is Julia Ellifrit. She is the Executive Director at Cornerstone of Hope Bereavement Center. Welcome, Julia.
Thank you so much, Angela, and good afternoon, everybody. We're going to talk about one of my favorite subjects to talk about, which is grief and loss. And I think especially because of COVID and everything that's going on right now, this is really pertinent. So the PowerPoint title, as you can see, is Grief at Work. When your heart's broken, your head doesn't work right. And that's why I think it's so important to talk about how we support grieving colleagues at work, because if your heart's broken because you've lost somebody, you've had trauma, your head just isn't always in the game in the same way that it was prior to loss or prior to trauma. And so we want to talk about how that works and how to support people. As Angela said, if you have questions, just either jump in or put them to her in the chat. Again, I think COVID has put a new spin, a new dimension on all of this, as you guys know, because you are on the front lines working with it. One of the things that we know about grief that kind of kicks off the bereavement process for people is the two things that we haven't been able to do. I think we're starting to now, but haven't been able to do for the last year, which is number one, visit our loved one in the hospital, whether they have COVID or whether they're in for something else, being able to hold their hand and say goodbye as they're dying is key to kicking off the grief process. And the second thing we haven't been able to do until recently is have a funeral. And that's the second component of healthy grief and bereavement, is being able to be supported in person by family and friends at a funeral service. So the two things that we know clinically we need to support people who are grieving, we haven't been able to do in the last year. So we're playing catch up on some level of that, but I say all that to say we're looking at grief a whole lot differently now because of COVID and as we're looking at everything differently. But let's just jump in. Okay, let's see why, there we go. So we're going to talk real quickly about grief and bereavement, but mostly want to focus on how it supports how it affects our job and how we support coworkers who are coming in that are grieving. So just real quickly, a grief overview affects 100% of us. It is the one thing that unites everybody across the globe. A percentage of the population will struggle with addictions or with mental health or with various other things, but 100% of us grieve. So that's why this is important to talk about. Grief is not a mental health diagnosis, even though the DSM is trying to do things to make that possible. How can something that 100% of us experience be a mental health issue? Grief is just a natural response to loss. It's the price we pay for loving somebody. The opposite of love isn't hate. The opposite of love is grief. The more we love somebody, the more we're going to grieve. And then grief is, because it's a normal response, well, we still treat normal, right? If your arm had a big cut on it, it would bleed. Would that be normal that it bleeds? Absolutely. But do we say, oh, well, that's normal, so we're not going to do anything about it? No. We still treat normal. We're still going to bandage it up or stitch it up. And with the same thing with grief, we still want to treat it even though it's a normal, natural response to loss. And I would also say death is a game changer for 100% of us. It changes how we process, how we think, what's important to us. When you have a loss, you have no tolerance for what I like to call petty crap. The stresses that all of us deal with, people who are grieving have no tolerance for that. So, for example, you have a miscarriage, you're grieving the loss, you go back to work and somebody says, oh my God, I was up all night, my baby didn't let me sleep, and I'm exhausted. You don't have any tolerance for that because of your loss. So that is critical to understand. And then the second thing is your priorities change when you had a loss. Maybe going for that promotion isn't important anymore. Maybe that planning for that big trip to Hawaii isn't important anymore. So what you tolerate changes and what's important changes, and that's key in understanding, helping people work. We also know that the use of a substance or the presence of a mental health diagnosis affects how we go through the process. And so if somebody has a mental health issue, not grief, but something else, they have major depression, they have personality disorder, that has to be treated separately and prior to really being able to help somebody through the grief process. Sometimes it can be done simultaneously, but if you're struggling with an addiction, I could be doing my best work for you, but if you go home and use a substance to cope, then really what I did as a grief counselor isn't effective, so we want to make sure that we're doing things in the correct order. So what's grief? It's the internal response to a loss. It's the feeling sad, the angst, the yuckiness, the crying. But the key here is that it's internal. So you can be grieving and people not know it. You could see a colleague at work that looks sad, and you think, okay, I wonder if they're just having a bad day or what's going on. Because unless you say, here's why I'm sad, people don't know. So grief is internally how you process a loss. So it affects us physically, emotionally, spiritually, psychologically, behaviorally, in every way. It affects us. It affects us in different ways, but for some people, maybe the effect is more social. They feel more isolated. For some people, the effect is more spiritual. I'm angry at God because my 4-year-old died. For some people, it's physical. They just have stomach pains and they get ulcers. So it affects us all differently, but affects us in all these ways. So C.S. Lewis, one of my favorite quotes about grief, the pain now is part of the happiness then, that's just the deal. So grief is just the price you pay for loving somebody. So when people sit in my office and cry, and they're devastated over a loss, I say, what a great testament to the great relationship you had with that person. Because if you weren't sad, you wouldn't be in my office. So the price we pay for loving somebody is that we're going to be incredibly sad when they're gone, right? So what grieving employees are going to potentially experience or feel in the workplace are all these things. Fatigue. Grieving is hard work. If you've ever heard the term grief work, it refers to the amount of psychological work that you do when you're grieving. And they've done research that shows, Therese Rando did research on this, shows that the amount of emotional work you do when you're grieving is tantamount to digging a ditch. So just the physical exertion that you'd have to dig a big ditch, that's what you're doing emotionally when you're grieving. So what that means is you're going to be absent-mindedness. Somebody's going to say something to you and you're just staring into space. You have trouble concentrating. There's just numbness. You're just numb really for the first year and a half or so after a loss. It means there's relationship difficulties. You had somebody in my office yesterday who their 14-year-old child died, and another friend came over and said, no, you really have to deal with the anger that you have at, so-and-so, and somebody she'd been mad at like 6 months ago. And who cares now? She kept saying, I don't care. I don't care about the relationship. But the friend that came over was, well, you need to, work through that. And you need to, again, when you've had a loss, nothing else feels important. Nothing, okay? So grief's a universal experience. It's a natural reaction to the end of a relationship as you know it. So grief doesn't end a relationship. It ends a life, but not a relationship. Your relationship goes from one of them being in person to one of memory, basically. So the relationship didn't end, it just changed, but it's the end of the relationship as you know it. It's basically that. So what's mourning? It's the opposite. Mourning is a public response. It's how you show the world that you're grieving. And it's very much tied into your culture. So in the culture I belong to, how we mourn is we go to the funeral home from 2 to 4 and 7 to 9. We go back the next day and put a purple flag on our car, and we drive in a line to the cemetery, and we stand around the grave, and we have a little service, and then we hop back in our cars, and we go back to the church for lunch. Right? That's how I mourn. That's how I show the world that I'm grieving the loss of a loved one. But what we know is it's very much tied into your culture. And what we know also is that if you are able to do what's important in your culture, what's normal in your culture, you're going to get through the grief process better. So if there, for example, are some Eastern European cultures that are very stoic in their grief, and, they kind of have a stiff upper lip. But if you said to that person, Mrs. Jones, you just need to cry and let it all out, you just messed up her grief, because that's not how they do it, right? There are some Latino cultures that are very demonstrative, and they wail and cry. And if you said to them, you need to sit quietly and respectfully in the front row, you just messed up their grief. What we know, again, is that we get through the process better if we're allowed to do what's culturally appropriate for us. So can you be mourning and people not know? No, because mourning is how we show the world that we're actually grieving, and again, very much tied into culture. So what are the tasks? What are we trying to do with people who are grieving? When people come to Cornerstone, or if they come to your EAP there, is the first thing is we're just adjusting to an environment without the deceased, without that person in it. So who am I now? How am I doing that? If you took care of your mother with Alzheimer's for 5 years, and every day you fed her and bathed her and took care of her, at some point after mom dies, there's this sense of, oh, what do I do with myself now? I identified as a caregiver, and I'm not taking care of anybody else. So who am I? Figuring out what that's going to be like. If you lost your only child, are you still a mom? How do you answer the question marital status if you lost a spouse? People will tell me all the time, I'm not single, I'm not married technically, I'm not divorced, I hate the word widow, I don't know what to check. And they'll stand for 10 minutes looking at that box that says check marital status, and they don't know what to check. I had a client in my office last week who lost a child. And in our intake paperwork, they fill out, who they lost and how and when and that kind of thing. And she filled out the, 8 pages of paperwork and HIPAA signature and all that, and left that one section blank, and she said, I can't write it down. I can't write down that I lost my child. So again, that figuring out how I interact in my environment without my person, that is that first step. The next kind of thing is reinvesting energy in this, and that's how we know that somebody's through the grief, the big chunks of grief, is when you can reinvest energy in life again. That does not mean if you lost a spouse or a partner, you get married again. That just means it takes a lot of energy to be in a relationship. Hey, how you doing? Right? It takes energy. And when that person dies, all your energy is being spent in the grief process. But when you can start volunteering at the hospital or learn to play golf, pick up a new hobby, when you can invest in life again, that's a sign you've worked through the biggest chunks of grief. But honestly, you're at the 2 to 2.5 year mark at that point after the death. Somebody started a lie. You've probably heard it. I hear it all the time. It takes a year to grieve. Big fat lie. It takes so much longer because that first year, you're just numb. You're going through the motions. You are putting one foot in front of the other. I tell clients all the time, if your shoes match, that's a great day for you. Because those little things are really, really hard to do because you're just numb. But we think, okay, if we get to the first year, the first anniversary of the loss, the first holidays, the first birthday, that I'm home free, and I'm telling you that's not how it works. There may be some physical therapists listening to this. The example I give to people is if you had a hip replacement. When you come out of surgery, you're thinking, okay, this isn't too bad. I think this is tolerable. I can do it, right? Because you've got some morphine in your system. You still got some anesthesia, and you're laying quietly in your bed. But the next day when they make you get up in physical therapy and stand on that hip, the pain's getting worse. The pain really isn't getting worse. You're just feeling it for the first time because the anesthetics are wearing out of your system. They're cutting back on the morphine, and you're standing on a brand new hip, and I want you to walk on it, right? That's what it's like in grief. That first year, you're just numb. That second year, all of a sudden, some of that numbness starts wearing off, and it feels like you're getting worse. You aren't. It just feels that way, but it feels very fresh and very new. Okay? And again, then finding the new normal. Who am I now without my loved one? That's the big key that we want to do. Accepting the reality of the loss with all that. Okay. Some things that make how we grieve different. I'm just going to quickly go through these. I will send Angela the PowerPoint so you can have it. But things that make how we grieve different from each other, because then I'm going to jump into the grief at work. One thing would be the nature of the loss, what that loss means to you. So the example I always give is if I went to the doctor and they said, Julia, you have a bad heart, you should never exercise again, I would say, thank God. I hate to exercise, right? That would not be a loss for me. That would be a celebration. But if you're a marathon runner and exercise is important to you, that would be a devastating loss. So the question is, what does that loss mean to you? It's the same loss. It means something different to me than it does to you. We grieve not only the people who died, but all the roles they had. I always say if my mom were to die first, my parents were married for 62 years. If my mom were to die first, my dad's never boiled water. He's never loaded the dishwasher, never run the laundry, he's never done any of that because they had a traditional marriage. Wouldn't work for me, but it worked for them. So if my mom were to die first, my dad loses not only his wife, but he loses the cook and the maid and the housekeeper. We grieve all those roles people had in our life as well. Coping skills, if you have a hanging on that ruins your day, you're going to have a hard time in grief. The age of the mourner is important. Kids grieve very concretely. They ask things like, Grandpa doesn't have his glasses on the casket. How's he going to see once he gets to heaven? They're very, very concrete in how they process this. It's not about feeling. It's about factual information. Teenagers, we do a lot of parallel play with them, just like you would with a toddler. Teenagers don't like talking about their feelings. They don't like making eye contact and talking about their feelings. And so we have areas at Cornerstone where we play the Wii, or we have video arcade games, or air hockey, or we play basketball outside. It's just easier to ask a 16-year-old, how you doing since Dad died, while you're shooting hoops with them. We tell parents all the time, in the car, on the way home from anywhere, is the best time to talk to your teenager, even if you're just asking how their day was. Everybody's eyes are facing forward. You've eliminated that threat that they don't like of intimacy, and you get a lot more information out of them. Past experiences, good and bad, are going to affect this. We talked about culture. Unfinished business, if you have a big argument with your loved one, they stomp out of the house and they got killed in a car accident, you're going to have some stuff to deal with that. Secondary losses are losses that only happen because of death is a primary loss. So an example would be if I'm married and my husband dies, I can't afford to make the house payment on my income, so I have to move to an apartment. So my primary loss is my husband. My secondary loss is the loss of my home. A secondary loss only happens because a death is a primary loss. So I had a client who, it was her first marriage, but her husband's second. They had custody of his children. He died very tragically, very suddenly, a horrific accident. When that happened, the court stepped in and gave the kids back to his ex-wife. She was late for work so many times because she was so bereaved. She literally couldn't get out of bed that she lost her job. And then because she couldn't make her house payment, her home went into foreclosure. So in a period of 4 or 5 months, she lost her husband, her kids, her house, and her job. And that's pretty much everything, right? The amount of secondary losses, the house, the kids, and the job, was almost more overwhelming than the loss of her husband, okay? Sudden versus expected, people will ask us all the time, which is harder, Julia, to lose somebody suddenly or expectedly, meaning they were in hospice or they've been ill for a long time. And the answer I say to people, which one is harder, is they both suck. Because death is just hard. It doesn't matter on some level if you knew somebody was going to die or if they had a massive heart attack, because at the end of the day, you still lost them, and that's just really, really hard. I will say that there's some differences in it. It's not that one's harder or easier. They're different. If you have the opportunity to say goodbye, to say, Dad, we're going to take good care of Mom, so whenever you need to let go, you go ahead. I'm sorry I was a jerk in high school. I love you. You can say a lot of things if you have the opportunity to. But I would also say that because you have the opportunity to doesn't mean you always do it. Because I worked in hospice for many years, and there were people who really believed that their loved one wasn't going to die, that there was going to be a cure, God was going to heal them. And so they had the opportunity to do some work ahead of time, and they didn't. So they would process that loss as if it was sudden. Okay? Concurrent stresses, you could be planning a wedding, and that's a happy thing, but a stressful thing that will impact how you get through the process. Perceived support. If you have a death that's stigmatizing, like AIDS used to be when I started in this field 35 years ago, you never said your son died of AIDS, he died of pneumonia, or he died of cancer. We've moved the needle on that, which is wonderful. We still get pretty judgy about suicide. There's a lot of judgment around that in the community, and so that's a difficult type of death to process. And the last one is disenfranchised grief. And that's a big old fancy term for grief that we can't talk about because it's socially negated. So what would be a grief that we couldn't talk about? I would say abortion's one. People say, well, you picked that, so why are you sad? It's a devastating loss. It really, really is. If I'm having an affair with a married man, am I welcome at the funeral? No. So that's disenfranchisement. If you are a gamer and you played hours every week with somebody in a different country, they were gaming, but you never met them, but you play and they died, there's a loss in that, but people don't recognize that because, well, you've never met them. They weren't your friends, right? And as I would say, Ariel Castro's mom. We all know Ariel Castro was a horrible individual, but at the end of the day, there is a mom who lost a son, and there's a legitimate grief in that. Where does she go in Cleveland with her last name, Castro, to get unbiased support? Disenfranchised grief. So what is our goal? The goal isn't to get over it. The goal is to remember with less pain. You don't get over people. You get over somebody stealing your purse. You could get over losing a job. You don't get over people. You learn to live without them. And that's really the goal we have in working with people who are grieving. So denial and avoidance are life-saving skills for the bereaved. There's a normal level of denial that we all have. And if you tell me you don't have it, you're proving my point to me, that we all have denial. But normal denial is, okay, if I hit the snooze button one more time, I can still be to work on time. Gosh, the dryer's shrinking my pants again. What's with that, right? That's normal denial. in grief, you're going to hear people making statements. You're going to hear people employees making statements that sound like denial, but it's not. Because nobody can be sad 24 hours a day. Nobody can grieve all the time, every day, day after day after day. So at some point they have to dose themselves and they have to take a break from their grief. And we encourage that. Because it's not a living to just be sad all the time. So sometimes how they take a break or how they process the painful reality is they make statements that sound like denial. Like, my husband's just away on a business trip. I'll see him at the end of the week. My daughter's away at college. I'll see her at the end of the semester. We never argue with denial because that isn't denial. That's what we call evasion from the new reality. Alan Mofelt said, evasion from the new reality is not denial. If the new reality is you're not going to see your loved one again this side of heaven, wow, I don't want to think about that. That's really, really hard. So I'd rather just think my son's away at college, right? If somebody has Alzheimer's and they say the sky is purple polka dots, would you ever say back to that person, no, it's not, it's blue? Of course not, because who cares if they think that? And their brain can't cognitively understand that. So we just don't ever argue with that. The same way with grief. We don't ever argue with denial. We don't ever say, no, your husband's not away on a business trip, he died. That would just be unkind. I had a client who, a few years ago, who lost her son in Iraq. He stepped on a landmine. And when you go to combat now, they take your DNA because there's body parts falling in battle. They found his head, his torso, and one arm. And so they nailed it back in a casket. The family had a funeral. A couple days later, they found his feet still intact in his boots. And so they shipped that back. They dug up the casket. They put the feet in. They had another funeral 4 times. 4 times they did this. The 5th thing they found was a finger. And she just said, no more. I can't have any more funerals for my son. So she had it cremated. She wears in a locket around her neck. And this is a few years ago, but she would come to my office every week and not say one word. And so we would sit there together just quietly, the two of us, for 1 whole hour. And sometimes there's not a lot of counseling that goes on in my office. Sometimes it's just holding somebody's pain for them for a few minutes, just to give them a break from the intensity of it. And that's the hour, that's the session. But at the end of every hour, neither of us had said a word. She would stand up to go, and she'd say the same thing. He's deployed. I'll see him at the end of the year. Now, is there any point in saying to her, no, he's not deployed? If anybody knows their person's died, she does. She's buried him 5 times. But her brain, her mind, her emotions, in order to tolerate that level of trauma, she just has to trick herself into thinking he's away in Iraq, right? Now, if it's 5 years from now and she's still saying that, then no, that's clearly unhealthy. But initially, we just let people have whatever denial they need. That's just a part of the process. So how we want grief to work is we'd like to make a straight line to the end, but this is what grief really looks like. It's this tangled ball of emotion, basically, and I ask a lot of clients, describe that feeling to me. Tell me what that ball's about. Another way of looking at it, because it's just a mess, right? Another way of looking at it is I'm going to get on my bike, make a beeline to the checkered finish, and be done with my grief. But that's what that really looks like. That journey is over rocks and hills and mountains and floods and waters, and it's just a rocky, rocky road on a general uphill motion. You can see that if he's going up to the finish line, but it's a rough terrain. People ask me all the time, does it get any better? And I'm all about telling the truth to people, because I think if you tell the truth, you can get through anything. I mean, think about those of you who work in oncology or in orthopedics. If you said, you know what, the surgery is going to be this, you're going to get 3 weeks of chemo, 2 days of radiation, and then you're going to be done with treatment. Or you're going to go through 6 weeks of physical therapy in the hospital, then you're going to go to a rehab center, then you're going home. If we know the truth and what the end game is, we could tolerate anything, I think, better than if it's just an unknown. Well, we don't know how long the chemo, it may last 2 weeks, it may last 2 years. Nobody can live with that. So telling the truth is so important. So when people say, does it get any better? I say, no, it doesn't. But it gets different. And that's the key. It doesn't get better, because getting better means you have your loved one back, and I can't do that for you. It gets different. So if I'm the container, and my grief is a black dot, what people want to have happen is that over time, my black dot, my grief gets smaller and smaller. But I don't think that's what actually happens. I think this is what happens. I think that grief stays the same, but our capacity to hold it gets bigger, right? So initially, grief is just in your face, and everywhere you look, and you can't not think about it, but at some point, it slides a little bit to the side, and you can still see and focus, and you can still, go to work and get together with your friends, and you hear a song on the radio that reminds you that grief is right back in your face, intense, and you process it, and then, you pass the restaurant you used to go to together, it's right back in your face, and then you process it, and it gets tucked neatly away again. So I think our grief stays the same. I don't think it goes away ever, but I think our capacity to hold it is enlarged, and that's what changes, right? So why is grief at work an issue? Why are we even talking about this? Because our jobs are a huge part of our daily lives. Most of us spend more waking hours at work than we do at home, than we do with our family, than we do with our kids. So it's a huge piece of our life, and so of course it's going to impact it. We can't, it would be nice if we could just kind of hide it and only grieve at home and not have it seep out into some things at work, but that ain't reality, right? But we also handle our grief differently in the workplace than we do at home. At home, we may be more comfortable just to cry all the time, and express grief differently. At work, we may feel like we have to pull it together, be strong. So we grieve differently at work than we do at home. If you're like most people, what goes on in your personal life is kept separate from work life. There are times, however, when your job performance may be affected by a significant life event, okay? So how we spend our time, these are old statistics, but the current ones are very similar. Most of us would spend almost 40% of our waking hours of our life at work, at our job. More than we spend sleeping, we spend working, right? Our leisure, our household, all pale by comparison to how much time we spend on the job. And that's, again, why this is important to talk about. So how do we grieve differently at work than we do at home? Great question. We don't always feel the liberty to express our emotions at work. Depending on what our job is and what our role is, we may not feel like we can say, I'm just having a crappy day today because I'm missing my loved one. So we don't always feel the liberty to talk about things at work, which is good and bad. We're going to find out. There isn't always privacy when we're having an acute grief reaction, what I call when you hear a song or you have a memory and just tears come instantly, you can't control it. Let me tell you, it's maddening for the bereaved person to feel like they can't control grief. They can't control when they're going to cry, when it's going to happen. But sometimes, if you're a nurse on the floor, there's no privacy, and you feel like, gosh, I'm having this grief reaction and people are watching. And again, we're going to talk about how to support that. We can feel compelled to have to talk about things when a coworker asks, right? So we can think, okay, I'm going to hold it together. I'm going to get to work. I'm not going to talk about this. I'm going to get through my day. I got to pass meds. I got to have my head in the game. And then somebody says, oh, how are you doing since your son died? And you're a blubbering mess. And you don't want that, but people ask. One thing I can tell you is that it would be important to talk to your supervisor if you're coming back from bereavement leave about how you want that to happen. I had a nurse who lost a child tell me when she was going back to work, she said, I emailed my boss and said, tell everybody not to ask me about it. I just don't want to know. I don't want to talk to them. I got to get my head in the game. I got to do my job. So tell them not to ask me anything about my son. So they did that. She comes in the next day for a session with me and says, nobody asked me. Nobody was sad that my son died. And I said, okay, well, wait a minute. Remember, you sent that email out. Well, it turns out that's not what I want. I want them to ask. So then she wrote another email. So then we talk about how you can manage that, because you can't have employees crying all day after every time somebody asks them. So again, we're going to talk about some strategies for that in a little bit here. If a coworker dies, that's a little bit different than if a coworker is grieving. If a coworker, the actual physical loss of a coworker, that's different, because there's that sense of security, like, okay, wow, that happened to somebody else. That could potentially happen to me. The loss of the workplace as it was. Now, we're all seeing this because of COVID. People that had to start working from home, or if you in your workplace as a nurse, had one death a month, and now you have 5 a week because your unit's, turned into a COVID unit. So the loss of the workplace as we know it, the loss of our role as it was. So if a coworker dies, am I picking up their shifts now, or are they going to replace them? So there's all this angst that goes around the grief after a coworker dies as well. So how our culture sees grief, you think of it like the flu. If you think about the flu, you feel bad, then you get worse, right? But bereavement is short-lived. The flu is short-lived. It's maybe a week or 10 days, and you start feeling better, right? Think about bereavement leave. It's also very short-lived. But you feel better in a linear fashion, a step-like fashion. I start breathing a little bit better. I start having a little bit more energy. I start to feel better. My temperature goes down. It's very much a step-like process, okay? When it's done, you go back to work after the flu, fully functioning. Okay, this is completely different from grief. What grief is like like having cancer, really. The symptoms don't go away if ignored, and they possibly get worse. If you ignore grief, it's going to get worse. The treatment's sometimes painful. I tell people when they come in, I'm going to rip the scab off your heart because we're going to talk about the hard stuff of grief in your relationship with that person. So sometimes it's painful. The treatment sometimes has side effects. People experience anger that they haven't, or unforgiveness, or bitterness. There's all these side effects that can come with it as well. When the treatment's done, you go back to work partially functioning for a while. And I think that is a key difference. After the flu, you're back to your normal self and you're working. With grief, it takes a long time. So when you go back to work after your 2 or 3 days bereavement leave, you're kind of limping along in a sense because you're not fully able, because you're still numb, you're not able to concentrate because of all the things we've talked about, you're not fully engaged in your job, right? So the grief recovery Institute did a study to connect the dots between grief and diminished productivity. And so American workers mourn the deaths of 2.4 million loved ones annually. So they interviewed 25,000 grieving people. All said their job performance was affected. So 100% of who they interviewed said their job performance was affected. 1.4 million incidents each year of diminished productivity were reported. And then alcoholism, abuse, and divorce may affect a large percentage of the population, but grief affects all of us. We started out by saying that. So with all these incidents of grief, think about the diminished productivity or loss of productivity. How does that impact your department, your hospital, the bigger picture, right? So hidden grief costs companies this is obviously still, I need to update these statistics, but $75 billion annually. Hidden's a key word because there's other issues that come up that are related to grief, but we don't always talk about them as being grief, right? So hidden grief because of the common and constant underlying cause of billions of dollars of unnecessary costs to companies large and small. Hidden because the word grief never shows up in an estimated $276 billion price tag industry due to alcohol and drug abuse. So the amounts of money that employers, that HMOs and insurances and people spend on alcohol and drug abuse treatment with the recidivism rate the way it is, it's huge. Some of those people are grieving, but we don't tag it as grief because we tag it as addiction, okay? That's why it's hidden. Nor does the word grief show up in the $300 billion estimated annual cost to industry as a result of stress. How many of you feel stressed? How many of you are referring people for stress management and stress counseling? And that's all 1,000% legitimate. What I'm saying is that some of those stress issues are because there's a bereavement. They had a loss because there's a grief involved. And if we don't address the grief, we don't really get to the full extent of understanding the stress. So that's why we talk about grief as a hidden issue, because it comes out in other things like eating disorders and alcoholism for your organization. The word grief never shows up in the estimated $117 billion cost of obesity and dieting and fads and trends and exercises. These are only a few examples of the hidden ways that grief affects U.S. companies. So if you look at the specifics, what happens here? The death of a loved one costs businesses $37.5 billion annually. That's why this is important to talk about, because it's costing you guys money, right? Divorce only costs companies $11 billion. Family crisis, $9 million. You can read through that. Pet loss, $2.4 billion. Other losses, $75.1 billion industry. And we're looking at supporting employees with EAP with their issues, but the biggest piece of that, the biggest chunk of that is death of a loved one. It's grief. So important to talk about. Adjusted to the 2018 statistics that I read, makes it $92 billion. That's a significant chunk of change, right? So among management level personnel, 85% indicate their decision-making ranked from very poor to fair in the months following the grief incident that affected them. So people who are in management who are grieving, 85% said their decision-making was poor. Okay, none of us want that for our organizations, for our departments, right? 60% of the managers said that some of their decisions had a direct negative financial impact on the company. What does that mean? They're making decisions that cause us to lose money or have a negative impact. That's significant. 80% said their interactions with supervisees was very poor to fair. So if your supervisor in your department is having a huge loss and it isn't processed or isn't dealt with in an appropriate way, 80% of them are not doing well with the people they supervise. That's a significant number, right? 25% said those interactions may have had a negative financial impact on the company. Huge. All right, I usually try to throw in something to see if you guys laugh, but I can't see any of you, so I'm going to assume you're laughing at my joke here. This is the morning break, but get it, it's MOURNING. I put this up here because pay your respects, $10. Wouldn't it be nice if it was that easy? Because it's really, really hard to support people who are grieving. This is not an easy thing to do. People who are grieving are all over the map. And it's almost like walking on eggshells when you come in, you don't know, is this going to be a good day for them or a bad day for them? And that's just legitimate stuff that, as managers and supervisors, you have to deal with. Because they don't know what their day is going to be like until they wake up that day. Because that's what grief does. It just kind of takes over. So this is just my fun way of saying, I said we could just put our $10 in the machine and be done with it. But it's not that easy. So there's no state or federal employment labor laws that require employers to grant bereavement leave. So I'm assuming that you all do that, and most companies do, but it's a generous benefit. It's not anything that's required federally. Although employers are not legally required to give workers time off, about 90% of companies in the U.S. do grant bereavement leave, okay? And then under the FMLA, you might be entitled to take up 12 weeks of unpaid time to care for family, but FMLA doesn't specifically provide bereavement leave. Now, the people are relaxing that a little bit, and I fill out paperwork regularly for people who really are struggling in their grief. It wasn't just my 90-year-old grandmother died and she was in hospice and we were all there holding her hand. Like, that grief is much different than my 4-year-old was shot in the face, and we've recently had that. So for people who have more traumatic stuff, they sometimes just need a little bit extra time off work besides the 3 days they give, and so we do fill out FMLA paperwork. But some organizations don't allow grief for that, so that's something that we just need to always educate people on. Facebook is changing the way we offer bereavement leave due to CEO Sheryl Sandberg losing her husband, okay? Again, it takes somebody in politics in big places to sometimes make some of these changes happen. In February 2018, Facebook changed its bereavement policy, giving every employee up to 20 days paid bereavement leave. That's generous. That's significant. That's life-changing for people to know I can really take the full time I need to grieve, come back to work in a little bit better shape emotionally because I had almost 3 weeks off versus I got 2 days off after my 14-year-old died, and I got to pretend like I'm engaged and I'm back working again. So you can see how the extra time off really brings the employees back at a much higher level functionally. But again, most of us are not going to give 20 days paid bereavement leave. SurveyMonkey followed suit this summer, and Microsoft and MasterCard are among a growing number of companies offering extended paid bereavement leave. So some of the bigger companies are starting to do that as well. Okay. The benefits are reciprocal, though. If you stand by your employee and do the right thing, even though, again, I know that we probably can't all give 20 days off, that is going to result in the employee being more loyal, more faithful. They're going to stand by. It's going to improve your bottom line ultimately in the end because you're going to have a more productive employee because they felt cared for. They felt like that you were understanding of the grief they were going through. Okay. So some suggestions for helping grieving coworkers. Physical health is really, really important. If you are not getting sleep, and many bereaved do not, lack of sleep mimics a lot of things. It mimics ADHD in children. It mimics depression in adults. So if we can just make sure we're taking care of the physical piece that they're eating, and they're getting enough sleep, that is usually a huge perk to help them. Because if you can't sleep, nobody can function on no sleep. Having a realistic view of what they're able to accomplish. So if you had a highly, highly productive employee, they're probably not going to come back at 100%. They're going to come back at 80%. And so how do we manage that? Our frustrations of their lack of productivity in our mind, can we adjust their goals or adjust their whatever their job responsibilities are, because they're not. We have to be realistic. They're not going to be coming back to the same place they left. Have them discuss where they're about a safe place to deal with their emotions. If we can schedule grief breaks, that goes a long way for helping bereaved employees. And I do this all the time with employees. If there's a bathroom or a private lounge or something, that if I'm the employee and I'm a nurse and I'm working 7 to 3, if I know at 10 o'clock I get a 15-minute break and I can go to that quiet space by myself and cry and process, I'm able, for the most part, to hold it together for the other 8 hours of the shift, because I know there's a time coming when I get to take a break and process my feelings and cry and just let it out a little bit. allow employees to schedule that, it comes out throughout the day periodically. Sometimes it comes out in anger towards a client, anger towards a colleague, it comes out in crying, having a little meltdown. But if we can schedule our grief into a break, that really goes a long way. Be alert to signs that other employees are having a hard time. There's things dinging. Okay, I'm going to assume, Angela, that if you can't hear me, somebody will say something to me. Be alert to signs that other employees are having a hard time. So, there's vicarious trauma. If you're working with somebody that lost, a colleague that lost somebody, and it was very traumatizing, if you hear that story enough, at some point, you start to feel a little bit traumatized yourself and maybe a little bit less productive. So just be aware of the other employees in the same team as the person that lost somebody, not just the bereaved person. And then encourage them to have a support system outside the job. Your job can't be your support system because when you go to work, you need to be, for the most part, working. So your support group can't be your colleagues because you can't all sit down for an hour and talk, during lunch because you've all got things to do. So encourage them to have a support system outside the job. This is really, really important. Being flexible with time. When you are grieving, you have a hard time getting out of bed. You really do. And I don't know how to explain that, except that 100% of bereaved people, that they cannot get up. They have no energy. And so, yes, they know they need to get to work. But if you can be a little bit flexible, if they have an 8 o'clock start time, and I know certain positions can't do this, but if you could say, as long as you get here by 8:30, you still have to put your 8 hours in. You can't, you're not giving them free time. But if you could be a little bit flexible, there are so many employees that say if they're not here right on time, they're going to get fired. And then that's just not helpful. It's not helpful for the bereaved. So if you could be a little bit flexible, that would be great. Be aware that employees may need to talk amongst themselves. At some point, everybody needs to talk to Susie because she lost her child and they want to touch base. And so to say you can never do that is not good, but let's schedule it. Again, if you schedule it, then it minimizes the disruption for the rest of the day. That, at 10:15, everybody's going to take a 10-minute break. We're going to just check in with Susie and see how she's doing, okay? Tell them you're sorry for the loss. Bosses that try to explain why things happen, that is never received well. So just say, I'm so sorry that you've had a loss, okay? Avoid statements like, I know how you feel, everything will be all right, you shouldn't feel that way. Those statements just dismiss their feelings, basically. So for managers, time may not heal all wounds, but it does help to reduce their intensity and rawness. So time doesn't really do anything but tick by, but time on some level is just what's needed for a bereaved person to get through the process. It's just going to be raw for a while. And as time goes on and time goes on and time goes on, they're going to start feeling a little bit better. There's not anything you could do. Listen, I would be a millionaire, I'd be on the Oprah Winfrey Show if I had, here are the 5 easy things to do, or take this pill or read this book and you will be done grieving. It isn't out there. It doesn't exist. But if we can help reduce some of that rawness, that's a good thing. Grief can leave managers feeling unsure about the best way to help somebody experiencing grief. As they say, you never can lead somebody through grief. You do good if you can actually just kind of manage them or, follow them through grief, because it's a very unpredictable type of experience, because some days you're okay, some days you're not. And you never know when your employee walks in, is this going to be one of those good days, or is this one of these days I got to walk on eggshells? But here's the thing, you shouldn't have to walk on eggshells. There's ways to manage grieving employees. There's ways to be sensitive and compassionate, but still you got to get the job done. You still have to get the job done, right? It can also be challenging when dealing with a performance issue when someone is grieving. So if somebody's been, on a performance improvement plan because their performance hasn't been great or their productivity hasn't been great, and then they have a sudden loss of somebody in their family, it's really hard because you're like, oh my gosh, I don't want to get them while they're down, but we still have to deal with those performance issues. So grief isn't an excuse to not perform your job well, but it helps to understand some of the issues around grief so that we can make some adjustments. While I cannot fix grief, listening to and supporting the grieved employee is one of the best things you can do. If you can just listen, that really you don't have to have the right words to say. People who are grieving don't remember anything you said to them unless you said something stupid, and then they're in my office talking about you. But they do remember just people saying, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. When I meet people for the first time at Cornerstone, first thing I say is, it's nice to meet you. I'm so sorry I have to. Because if I have to meet you, that means you've had a loss, right? Second thing I say is, I promise this is survivable. It's absolutely survivable. So be aware of each other. Contact the family of the deceased Sometimes people, when an employee dies, the families, they just want to know about their person. They want to know about their last day. They want to know any information. So always feel free to contact the employee or the family. I would also make sure, though, that I found out from the family what was permissible to share with the team. We see this a lot in suicide. Families do not want their coworkers to know it was a suicide. And so obviously, because of HIPAA and all that, we are not going to disclose anything that family hasn't said. So if the family says, just tell them that it was an accident, as an employer, you want to honor that and respect that. But what I try to tell families, though, is that the internet's out there. People are going to find out. So better to be truthful and honest about what happened because they're going to find out anyway. But accept the fact that their work's going to be affected. There's just the productivity is going to be done. That's just a reality. Attend or organize a memorial service. If you can attend the memorial or the funeral program, that just speaks volumes to the bereaved. Like, oh my goodness, my boss was there. They must really love me. Consider establishing a memorial at work. Maybe there's a bulletin board somewhere where when somebody's had a loss, they can just put up a butterfly with a name on it, a first name on it, or something that just recognizes the fact that, yeah, there are people dying, especially now because of COVID. There are people dying, and we just want to remember them. The treatment the wound gets determines whether time brings healing or hate. I love the Charlie Brown because he always says good grief. And I think that's what I'm all about, good grief. Like grieving in a way that's healthy and good and works us through the process from point A to point B, where we are a productive employee, we are engaged in life, we're happy, we're going to be different than we were prior to the loss, but we can be whole and happy again. So I love this quote because if I had a big cut on my arm, I could pretend it's not there, pull my sleeve down, or I could get it cleaned out and get stitches. And if it gets infected, now I've got an IV. If it gets gangrenous, now I cut my arm off. So the treatment I give that wound determines whether I keep my arm. It's the same thing in grief. The treatment we give our grief, the processing of it, the feelings, the family, the treatment we give all of it determines how we're going to get through it. So 85% of men on death row lost a parent early in childhood. 85%. That's a lot, right? Makes you wonder if anybody asked them about that. And would their lives have been different had we had grief counseling for them? And we provided that. In some of the urban neighborhoods in Cleveland where kids are just getting shot and drive-by shootings, if you watch your cousin get gunned down, you have two choices, right? Pick up a gun and retaliate or go get some grief counseling. And they're not doing the latter. And part of it's because it's not accessible to them, and that's on all of us. But the treatment I give that wound of grief determines whether somebody's going to grow up and be a drug user, because if you had a really horrific loss and you can't begin to process it, it's so painful, and somebody says, if you take this pill, it makes all those bad feelings go away, guess what? They're right, it does. But now you're addicted. And so we believe we could change the recidivism rate in facilities where people are in and out because nobody's talking about the grief. So this is my plug for good grief. Make sure that we're doing that. And then this is the last slide. It is raining only on the person on the left. It's like the Ziggy cartoons that are sunshine and rainbow for everybody, but Ziggy's got a big old rain cloud. So many times I hear clinicians here, especially interns, graduate interns, saying, oh, I want to make them stop suffering. I want to take their suffering away. It's just so hard and so sad. And to which I reply, last I checked, you are not God. You can't take suffering away. I'm not God. I can't take suffering away. I believe there's a purpose for that, for suffering. But what I can do for somebody who's experiencing a lot of suffering and pain and bereavement, all that, is I can hand them an umbrella, right? So if I hand you an umbrella and it's raining on you, now all of a sudden the rain's not beating down on your head. Now the rain's beating down the umbrella. So it softens the blow of the rain. But can I make the rain go away? No, I can't. I'm not God. I can't make that happen. But if I can hand you an umbrella, spiritually speaking or emotionally speaking, by giving you the tools that you need to lessen the effect of the suffering that's going on for you, now I'm doing my job, right? By providing education or coping skills or training, now I'm doing my job. But I cannot make anybody not suffer because I just don't have that skill, right? I'm not God. So to me, our role is to hand out umbrellas to people, physically, spiritually, emotionally. And if I don't have an umbrella to give you, I'm going to stand in the rain with you. Because at the end of the day, it's just all about connection anyway. The opposite of grief is connection. So I believe that's all. Do you guys have any questions? I have talked for an hour, and I have a screen, so I'm hoping somebody has questions.
I haven't had any questions come in just yet. If you'd like, we could wait a minute, see if anyone has any questions about it. Someone made a comment about your grief getting easy, not getting easier, but getting different. They thought that was a nice way to look at that
Yeah.
point. Mhm.
Yeah, it's true.
And then also I'll have your contact information for everyone who wants to get a hold of you or get a hold of Cornerstone. So I will
Yep.
send that out to everyone who attended and has their information in their display name. So
Okay. And also one other thing, Angela, is that we did get a grant from the Adams Board to provide free counseling and services for anybody who is a frontline worker or hospital worker. So you don't have to be a doctor or nurse. You could be the housekeeping person. You could be radiology. You could be nutrition, whatever it is. If you work at UH, which all of you do, obviously, and you need some counseling for grief, either personal grief or just because you're overwhelmed because of the COVID and the amount of deaths, our services are completely free to you.
great, that's a great benefit. That's nice that they provided that to you and that you're providing that to our frontline workers. Uh, Someone said, thank you for pointing out the lack of access. It is not as simple as simply seeking help when you don't have access to resources to do so.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's not just people in urban areas. There's people, in all over that have lack of access. I think there's a group of, I call them the working poor, people, and I would include myself in that. I make a nice salary, but I can't afford, $175 an hour for a counselor every week and one for all my kids too. If you're rich, it doesn't matter. You have money, and if you are on, Care Source or Medicaid, that pays for it. But it's the people who, we have money but not enough maybe for services. I think we're the group that needs the support. So
yes.
I totally get it. Lack of support, lack of access.
Someone wants to know, for families interested, are your services in person or telehealth right now?
They are both. When COVID hit last March, we went telehealth for a few months. Now we opened back up, and we were considered by the governor's essential worker, providing grief counseling since they couldn't do funerals and all that. So we have been in person since last May, but we still do both. There are some people that still don't want to come in. They still just prefer the telehealth because they haven't been vaccinated. There's people who said, I'll wait till you open back up. I don't like telehealth. So we do both. I would say right now we're probably 25% telehealth and 75% in person. When you come in person, though, as does everybody, we take your temperature. You have to wear a mask. We spray every chair they sit in. As soon as they get up from a counseling session, we spray down the room. So we are very COVID compliant for the in-person.
Okay. Someone's making a comment that no one tells you how difficult it is when you lose your mother.
Right. Because it's like moms aren't replaceable. Like that's mom. Yeah.
Right.
Losing a mom is hard. Losing anybody is hard, but there's just something different about a mom. Totally get it.
Someone wants to know if denial is blocking something a family needs to do for grief, then what do you recommend?
Then we recommend having an intervention, basically like you would if it was denial and something else. But again, denial in grief is, again, my husband's away on a business trip. I'm going to see him at the end of the week. Typically, that's very short-lived, and it's, by talking to them, there's not a problem usually, because usually they know that their person is not living. But if it does affect family relationships, that you can say, hey, Mom, remember that Dad died, and you could certainly talk about that. But for the most part, there usually isn't an issue by just letting them have it, by letting them have that. If that's what they need to survive right now in the moment emotionally, there's no problem with that.
Okay, and someone's asking, how do you recommend contacting for your help? Do you want to give them your information out? I can type it in the chat as well.
Sure. Our phone number is 216-524-HOPE, and it's the O, not the 0, 524-HOPE. Or you can email me at Julia, my first name Julia, at cornerstoneofhope.org. And then I can send you over to our intake person, and we'll get you scheduled. And also, I tell this to people all the time, if you've got a group of, you know, 6 or 7 staff members there that all want a group, we'll come to you and do a group. We could do it as a brown bag lunch, you know, every Wednesday for 6 or 7 weeks, from 12 to 12:30 or whatever. We could do a little mini group there, if that would be helpful.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Great. I'll also include the contact information again in the email I send out. So everyone who has like their contact information in their display name, most of the time email addresses, or if your username is on the Zoom, it will pull your email address from your username. So I can send out emails to everyone who attended with the presentation, as well as Julia's contact information. So Julia, thank you so much for today.
You're
The
welcome.
presentation, and thanks everyone for attending, and you guys have a good afternoon.
Enjoy the sunshine.
Yes,
Bye-bye.
thank you. Bye-bye.